Well, he can come to me. I do keep saying Christians should just leave these guys alone. Unless they've got a Christian camera. There's no Christian camera there. And this is not helping. People like Shamsi are not going to be converted by your arguments, so don't waste your time.
I like that statement.
Right. Just for the record, whenever Shamsi's ready, I'll be ready to debate him. But we know that's not going to happen anytime soon. Okay, guys, I wanted to move out of the heat, partly because of the topic that I want to talk about. So I want to talk about VJ Day. Sorry, VE Day. VE Day. Yes, exactly. So obviously this week we're commemorating VE Day, and I want to talk about a little bit about that from a Christian perspective, but also someone who was born and raised in this country, whose family is entirely British, and has been for over 1,000 years. So so I got deep roots in this land. So I'm talking about the bit of the national story. And I just want to point out that VE Day is obviously a celebration of the sacrifices of the soldiers and the families of this country, and should be of the empire abroad, who fought in Europe and suffered on these islands and around the world. And it is right and proper that we do remember that. It was a big deal. But it is something that points to another kind of religion. And it's the religion of nationalism, or the religion of statism. Because, for instance, how many of you commemorate the Reformation Wars and the 8 million Christians that died in those wars? Devastated Europe, transformed Europe. But it's not like we have cultural celebrations to remember those wars. We just remember the act of the Reformation. Because in the pre-modern world, the thing that defined your identity was your belief in God and what you believed about God and His church. So people mark Reformation Day in different ways. Whereas we're marking VE Day because of statism and the idea of belief in the national identity. Now, as someone whose families fought in those wars, fought in the wars with regards to, I obviously distract Shamsi. So obviously, as someone whose families fought in those wars, I can and do honour their sacrifice. And VE Day is as good a day as any to do that. And anyone whose family was connected to the efforts and the struggles of World War II, whether you're British or one of the soldiers of the empire that came and fought, like the many Caribbeans that came and fought for the British, or the Indians that fought for the British, you have a right to remember VE Day and VJ Day as your own, and to celebrate that with us. But I think we should keep it as a familial commemoration, not as a national commemoration. The reason why I say that we should keep it as a familial and not national is because in our culture we flipped it the wrong way round. You celebrate Christmas and Easter in your families, and then you celebrate VE Day and VJ Day as a nation. But I think we need to swap that and celebrate Easter and Christmas as a nation, and remember VE Day and VJ Day as a familial memorial when we tell the stories of our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And I want to be clear, there is a perception among some British patriots that the British stood alone in World War II. It was Britain alone against the might of the Nazis and the Japanese. Not true. There were 6 million soldiers of the Empire gathered from India and the Caribbean and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and countries in Africa, South Africa, right up through Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, where people came to fight for the British. And we mustn't ever think that it was Britain on its own, our tiny little island. But it was, for a time, the British Empire that stood alone. When the war started, the British Army was slothful, slack, a bit undisciplined. And that's why at the beginning of the war, the British suffered a number of big setbacks. By the end of the war, the British Empire and its fighting forces were some of the leanest, meanest and most disciplined armies on the planet. By the end of the war, the British, by their own dates, were the only empire, the only people who started the war on day one and were still standing at the end of the war. Everyone else came late or was conquered. If you use the British dates, of course. Now, I want to point out, when you think about what those people fought for, and then you look at our country today, we, I think, could rightly be condemned for not honouring what they fought for. Can you honestly say that the Britain that we look at today is something that those soldiers died for? A country of soy snowflakes, a culture that doesn't know itself, a lost sense of identity, communistic ideas that mean that we can't even tell what a man and a woman is. The reality is that we have dishonored the great sacrifice of all those millions of soldiers. And why? Because we haven't preserved the nation and the culture that they died for. Any questions on that point before I move on?
I think you're obviously talking in very general terms, and each soldier will have had something that they're fighting for. I'd argue that freedom is the overall thing that people fought for, and therefore the freedom to live their life how they want to.
Right.
Whether they soy, whatever their views are.
Yes. Great point. Yes, it's a very good point. And it is fair that the liberal states did frame their understanding of World War II as a conflict about maintaining freedom. But when they talked about freedom, they were talking about freedom from the Nazis, freedom from Nazism. But you look at our culture today and look at how many Nazi ideas we've incorporated into our culture. We're introducing a euthanasia law. That was something the Nazis did. We've introduced an abortion law. That's something that the Nazis did. We've introduced into this country the idea of legal polyamory. That was something the Nazis did. We've introduced into this country the idea that a gay couple can go to some other part of the world, buy a child and raise it as their children, denying that child access to their real mother or their real father or both. The Nazis did that when they kidnapped thousands of children who were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. In countless ways, we have started to incorporate Nazi ideas. Why? Because Nazism and liberal secular humanism have the same root. Nazism is a cult of liberalism. And so the reason why we had to fight Nazis in the first place was because of the very liberal ideals that the soldiers were fighting for. I'll take one more question before I move on.
Is it true that the tablet for this abortion, the kids and that, is the same what they killed the Jews with? What they done the Jews, they gassed the Jews out with? You know
Right.
about the tablet?
So the question is the chemical that is used in abortion tablets the same one that was used to kill the Jews? I don't know, but it will take you all of 2 minutes to Google the answer. Just look up the ingredients and you'll see. Okay, I want to move on. I want to be clear that as Christians, as a Christian who is proud of my family's contribution to the war and my great-grandfather's service and my great-great-grandfather's service in World War I, World War II and the Korean War, that I as a Christian do not want to participate in the religiosity of statehood. I don't believe that the cenotaph is sacred. I don't believe that the idea of Britain's war in World War II was some kind of holy crusade. Though both President Franklin, Winston Churchill, and a number of bishops in the Church of England did try to frame it that way at different points. But, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say as a Christian that my history is the history of the church, not the history of the British Isles. And so whilst by blood I am proud of my family service, I don't want to participate in the rituals of state religiosity, because as Christians we can only serve one God, and that God cannot be the state. That God must only be the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Any questions on that before I move on to my next point? Okay, so there are some people that have made a hoo-ha about the appearance of Ukrainian soldiers in the parade. It is true that Ukraine fought on the side of the Nazis. It is questionable whether they did so willingly or whether they did so as a matter of political expediency. However, regardless of that historical debate, the presence of Ukrainian soldiers in the processions that occurred this week are in no way an affront or an offence to my family's memory. Why? Because it is a statement about political solidarity with Ukraine today that has suffered an illegal invasion under Putin. A man who has embodied the very idolatry that I am talking about. A man who has used the Russian armed forces to invade and attack Christians despite the fact that he makes a great display of his Orthodox Christianity. An anathema that a Christian leader should send Christian armies to wage war against Christian populations. But that same leader refused to send armies to defend Christians when Azerbaijan carried out a genocide against Armenian Christians in Artsakh. This is why, as Christians, we must guard ourselves from statism or the false doctrines and religion of nationalism. Our nation is the church. Our nation is the people of God. And the thing that makes us the people of God is that we are bound together by the new covenant. That is who we are. That is our identity as Christians. Any questions on that before I move on to my next point? Go on.
Isn't the head of the Orthodox Russian Church also supporting the war in Ukraine? And isn't also, what does that mean as Russia is the biggest Orthodox Christian country population-wise per head?
Okay, do you want, yeah.
What does that mean?
Okay, so here's what it means. It means this. It means that every church, and the Russian Orthodox Church is no exemption, can be penetrated by false doctrines and false beliefs. The church is the people of God, not an institution. And any institution that the church creates can be taken over by non-Christians or fall into error. And state nationalism and the religiosity around it is error. The fact that the Russian patriarch is justifying a war against other Christians shows that he is bowing to the altar of Mother Russia more than he is bowing to the Lord Jesus Christ. It is idolatry of the first order. Christian governments and Christian rulers must only marshal Christian armies to fight against the enemies of Christ, like the Mujahideen who attacked the Christians of Artsakh, or like the Mujahideen in Syria who are waging war against Christians, Druze and Alawites, or like the Mujahideen who are waging war against Christians in northern Nigeria, or the Janjaweed that are waging war against Christians in South Sudan, or against those terrorists attacking Christians in the Philippines, or against the Burmese government that is attacking Karen Christians in Burma, or against those communists that are persecuting Christians in North Korea, or the Islamist government that is persecuting Christians in Iran. Incidentally, Russia, because of nationalism, has made an ally of Iran, China, and North Korea, enemies of the church, that they are now friends with Russia because Russia is bowing to statism and not to Jesus. The discipleship of Russia has gone deep at home, but it hasn't gone abroad in its foreign policy. Okay, I want to press on. Actually, I'll take one more question on that before I move on. Any other questions on that point? Okay, I'll move on. So talking today, and I just want to invite you, move in a bit please, so I don't have to shout as much. I promise everybody had a shower this morning, nobody smells. So ladies and gentlemen, right now the British Armed Forces in total only number 180,780 people. That is a tiny, tiny army. Britain, the United Kingdom, has become a low-tier first world army. Let me give you a football analogy to help you understand. It's like being at the bottom of the Premier League. The British Army, in terms of its military might, is at the bottom of the Premier League. We are no longer a superpower, and we need to accept that we are no longer a superpower. And the reason why we are no longer a superpower is because every generation chooses to direct more resources into the NHS and the welfare state than they do the military. We are literally dying. One idol is dying because of another idol. The idol of the NHS and the welfare system is literally what is draining the British Armed Forces of the necessary resources. Let me give you a geopolitical reason why Britain should invest in having a major military presence. and push itself up into the middle of the Premier League. Because when you are a power in the world that can project your might anywhere in the world, governments will listen to you. That is why everybody listens to America, because America can fight on multiple fronts at the same time. America can project its power to any part of the globe. And so when America speaks to a country listens. And just as the Houthis are discovering in Yemen, when you ignore America's requests, there are consequences. That is why Britain should invest in having a strong military. I want to point out to you, ladies and gentlemen, in our continued reflection of World War II and VE Day, that I personally believe that if the United Kingdom was faced with an external threat like it was between 1939 and 45, that Britain could not resist successfully in the same way as it did then. Why? Because the ingredients of Britain are no longer the same. We are now a multicultural society where we have populations in this country whose allegiance is not to this country, as shown by the fact that the recent flare-up in India and Pakistan has resulted in Indians and Pakistanis facing off to one another in the streets, or as the countless Islamist terrorist supporting marchers against Israel's legitimate war in Palestine have demonstrated. It has resulted in the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that many in the British nation might fight against us rather than fight with us, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we haven't been raised with the kind of stoicism and manliness that the previous generations were raised with. Fix it and make do. Carry on. These kinds of phrases only made sense in a culture that taught the virtue of perseverance. We don't live in that culture anymore. Today everybody's competing to be a victim. And the British are, and across every public institution in the land, we are lowering standards. A Royal Marine Commando has recently been dismissed from the armed forces because he talks about the danger of lowering standards to let women into the Royal Marine Commandos. He is not lying. If you lower standards, you get less fit, less able soldiers. I have personal experience with a nurse who's a teacher of other nurses in the NHS, and she has told me directly that they are lowering standards in the NHS so that they can recruit nurses. Our country is going in the wrong direction because it is badly governed. It is badly governed. Furthermore, another reason why our country could not face an external threat as it has done today, as it did in World War II, is because of general disillusionment with the establishment. Personally speaking, I am as likely to use a gun to overthrow the elites as I am to fight for the elites. And I am not alone in thinking that way. The contract between the governed and the governors has been broken by the government, by the social elites. They have betrayed the British people by creating a two-tier police force, a two-tier judiciary, and now, with its recent trade deal with India, a two-tier economy in which it is more expensive to employ a British-born worker than to employ an Indian immigrant. They have created a two-tier culture, and many people in this country feel stabbed in the back by our social elites. So why would we fight for them? Please come in. Don't be shy. Any questions on that point, please, before I move on?
Initially compared increasing NHS with the military thing.
Yes.
But it could also be like, you can also increase taxes, tax the rates and stuff like that.
I'm so sorry, I didn't understand. Say that again.
Like you can, for example, increase the tax slabs and other things. Why did you compare NHS and military when you can tax the rich or something?
So why did I compare the military to the NHS? Because I was making a general point about the lowering of standards across state institutions. We are getting policed worse. We are getting cared for in the NHS worse. We are being defended by less trained and less able soldiers. Every part of the British establishment is lowering standards for the sake of recruitment. That is a problem. What we need to do is keep the standards high and use the right kind of training to get people to the proper standards. Our standards were higher in the past. Our country was run better in the past. And that's not me just romanticizing things. That is a reality. We all feel that our country is doing less well. That's not by accident that we all have that common experience. What's got better for us in this country? Can you tell me something? Life standards are going down. Life expectancy is going down. The British military has been downgraded by our peers. Nothing has got better. Everything has got worse. Any other questions on this point before I move on?
That's a natural phenomenon. Anything that goes up must come down.
The brother is absolutely right. It is the natural phenomena of success. There's only one direction you can go from the top, and that's to go down. Britain was at the top. He only had one place to go. But the problem that I'm pointing out is that rather than resisting decline as much as we can, our governments have started going along with the decline. In other words, they're inculcating decline by lowering standards. Now, I want to move on in my reflections about VE Day. I'm not going to shout, so if you can't hear me, it's your own fault. You'll have to move in. What we need in this country is a deeper sense of nationalism. A deeper sense of nationalism that is rooted in the full history of these islands, embodied by families like mine that have been in this country for over 1,000 years. Let me finish, I'll take questions. And that means that if we are going to have a deeper sense of nationalism, we have to create and understand national identity as framed by the Christian faith. Because the Christian faith formed and fashioned and molded every aspect of our nation. In culture, it created the festivals that we celebrate, the language that we speak. Every word and the grammatical structure of what I'm saying to you was formed by the influence of the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. We celebrate festivals like Easter, Good Friday as a bank holiday because of our Christian identity. It influenced our economic practices. It's why Britain abolished the slave trade and spent blood and money to stop the slave trade around the world. It influenced our economic and domestic policy and should do again. The reason why our country is in decline is because of it has a shallow sense of its own identity. The way that we establish a strong identity is by allowing that identity to influence both domestic and foreign policy. So, for instance, we should favour Christian migrants and Christian refugees over others. Why? Because they will be able to integrate more easily into a culture that is Christian. We shouldn't be fighting wars or sending money to Islamist terrorists in Syria like David Lammy has on your behalf. Every one of you as a taxpayer, David Lammy has sent £70 million of your money to Islamists in Syria. It should influence our social conduct. We should understand that public behaviour should be governed by Christian ethics and Christian morals, and that we should pursue a life that is governed by Christian values. So, for instance, let me finish. So, for instance, we should abolish abortion, and we should abolish the euthanasia law. Let me finish, and I'll take questions. Just in case you haven't heard, let me finish, and then I will take questions. It should influence our educational system. Children should be taught the Christian history of the nation. They should be taught Christian ethics, Christian values, Christian doctrines. They should be taught the idea of a Christian identity, or at least a way of relating to it if they are not Christian. Because Christians don't believe in forcing their religion onto others. It should frame the national story. In other words, the deeper nationalism that we need is a Christian nationalism. And why is that advantageous? It is advantageous because, unlike liberal multiculturalism that says Muslims live by your values, Hindus live by your values, Christians live by your values, atheists live by your values, and then the state will just impose liberal values on you anyway, and those different values stir up conflict between different communities, like we saw in Leicester between Hindus and Muslims, like we've seen between Muslims and Jews in Golders Green, or between Christians in Manchester and in Birmingham and East London. A Christian nationalism would mean that everyone from every part of the world who is Christian would be able to integrate into the same national story. A Christian from India could identify with the Christian story of Britain because they are also Christian. Christian from Ethiopia could do the same. St. Paul's Cathedral in London belongs more to an Indian, Pakistani or Ethiopian Christian than it does to a white English atheist. Furthermore, a Christian nationalism would not tolerate extremists from within the Muslim community or the Hindu community. It would deal with them because such extremism would not be permitted in word or deed. Any questions on that point, ladies and gentlemen? Go on. On the question. What's your question on the topic?
So, obviously, I'm not a Christian, you know. Let's say that there's different Christians, Indian Christians, black Christians, white Christians. There's races in between them. How are you going to sort that out?
So, ladies and gentlemen, within a Christian nationalism, bearing in mind that the national identity of the Christian is defined by our loyalty to the new covenant. That is something that everyone can buy into regardless of their ethnicity. In other words, to join the people of God, you simply sign up to the new covenant. That means that as Christians, racism is an anathema to Christians, which is why Christian ethno-nationalists who are trying to hijack Christianity to push some kind of white paradise or acting and speaking contrary to the faith. If there was racism between different groups of Christians, the state would step in on the grounds that such racism contradicts the new covenant and would discipline both parties. Any other questions on that part of the talk?
Yeah. What's our current world example that you would go for? And how did they get there? If it's a country or a city that you think holds Christian nationalism.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the question is, are there any nation states that are examples of Christian nationalism that embody the universality that I've just talked about? There is only one example. It's called the Vatican State. And the Vatican State, as you saw from the recent conclave, had bishops from every part of the world. African, Asian, Latin American, and Caucasian. But this is something that every Christian nation should embody. And that's why those that talk about Christian nationalism but want to limit it to the idea of just being Polish, Caucasian, have distorted Christian teaching. Hope that answers your question. Right. Let me move on. Finally, in terms of my reflections of VE Day, I want to say that this country needs to grapple with the fact that we have all the ingredients of a civil war in this nation. Go and look at any civil war that has happened in the last 50 years or the last 75 years. Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Syria, Burma. Every one of those countries has been a multi-religious, multi-ethnic state with multiple loci of identity and multiple loci of organization. We have created the map of a civil war in the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not being an alarmist. I am not saying that a civil war is round the corner. But I am saying that it is a distant possibility on a faraway horizon. How can we avoid this possibility?
Can I say...
No, let me finish. No, let me finish. Let me finish and then I'll take questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, how can we avoid that possibility? Integration. Integration must not be an option. It must become a requirement. Everyone who comes to this country must integrate by law. And that should be seen by conduct, in terms of the language you speak, in terms of the things that you protest about, in terms of the things that you say politically, in terms of where you send your charity, in terms of how you dress, in terms of how you eat. Integration must be an expectation within a flexibility that is permitted by the Catholicity of the Church. It must not be an option. And those that refuse to integrate must either be deported or they must be made outlaws. In other words, beyond the protection of the state. If you want to be alien, if you want to be foreign, if you hate this country, there should be no space for you. You must be driven out. Integration must be absolute. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you examples of communities that have integrated. Many Afro-Caribbean communities have integrated. Their grandparents and their great-grandparents are examples of integration. The Yemeni communities, the Yemeni grandfathers were examples of integration. There are examples of integration. The fact that there is resentment among certain youth of those communities is more connected to liberal progressive culture than it is from anything that they would have learned from their great-grandparents. Any questions on that point?
See, with the integration, you see, the logic of the oppressor is not the same as the oppressed.
Yes.
You mentioned West Indians and so on and so forth. That's a bad example for me. You mentioned Rwanda. That's a very bad example for me. But I agree that
What's your question, sir?
the question is,
What's your question? Just ignore him, he's a troll. Just ignore him.
you see, I want you to understand that freedom, what you're talking about is the ugly face of democracy. Democracy is what is destroying the British.
What's your question, sir, please?
Well, I'm coming if you allow me.
Give him time.
If you allow me.
You've been speaking for 1 hour.
How many pages?
If you allow me. Do you think that integration in your own definition is correct?
Right.
The question I say is, do you agree with me that integration is relative?
Right, ladies and gentlemen. So the question is, do I agree that integration is relative? Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. Because there are some cultures that are outside of the UK that will want to organise them differently. I'm offering to public debate in this country and to those in the English-speaking world that there is a different path that we can follow from the evident liberal failure that we see across the Anglosphere. And that is the expectation of integration. But the expectation of integration assumes that you're giving people something to integrate into, which the liberals have completely failed to do. You must give people something, an identity to integrate into that must be historical, cultural, political, social, economic, ethical, and what that must be is Christian, because the history of these lands is Christian, ladies and gentlemen. Any other questions?
You answered the question.
Well done, Bob. Well done, Bob.
All right, thank you guys. Any other questions?
Well done, that's it.
Don't wait for the troll. I'm not engaging with him. He's a troll. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Why do you give you a question if you don't answer any question? I don't understand what's the point.
Going once,
Carry on. Waffling.
Going twice,
Carry
so.
on.
going twice. Don't wait for the troll, guys. I'm not engaging with him. If you've got a question, ask.
That's it.
Carry on waffling.
Going three times,
Carry on waffling.
and we're out. Thank you very much. Good night. Good.